Roger Rabbit, the famed animator has authored many books and made significant documentaries, including a 2017 film about the Gamble House, where he came to know Ted Bosley. Don will introduce our speaker and moderate the Q&A after the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Eric. And thanks everyone for joining us today. It's a real privilege to be here and introduce Ted. I did meet Ted when I was making the Gamble House documentary for PBS, and I always try to pride myself on finding things that Ted either hadn't seen or didn't know, and I never actually found anything that Ted didn't know about or hadn't seen. So that was my failure and miscalculation of Ted's amazing knowledge of the arts and crafts movement. Ted, as you know, is the executive director of the Gamble House Conservancy. He's been at the Gamble House in various capacities since 1990, and publishes and lectures widely on green and green and the arts and crafts movement, and has taught historic site stewardships, heritage conservation master's degree program at the University of Southern California School of Architecture, and for the School of Arts and Humanities at Claremont Graduate University, and a guest lecturer at USC's popular Great Houses of Los Angeles course for more than 25 years. His full-length book, Green and Green, is the premier study of the architect's work. He co-edited the exhibition publication, A New and Native Beauty, the Art and Craft of Green and Green at the Huntington Library. And the exhibit then went on to the Smithsonian. He contributed a chapter to the Maynard Parker Modern Photography and the American Dream book, a joint publication with Huntington and Yale University Press, and was an editor and contributor to the Gamble House Building Paradise in California. In 2016, Ted curated an exhibition of at the Huntington Library exploring the architectural photography of Yasuhiro Ishimoto, and Ted's currently researching a book on the topic. And in setting up for tonight, I originally signed up for this lecture because I knew nothing about the Swedenborgian Church. In fact, when I first heard Swedenborgian, I was fairly sure it had something to do with the Muppets and the Swedish chef on the Muppets. I've been told since that that is wrong, and I'm relying on Ted to set me and all of us straight. So please greet Ted Bosley.
Thank you very much, Don. You're not too far off, as you'll discover from this talk. There's something sort of Muppetish about this story, at least as you're going to hear it from me. I really appreciate that very kind introduction, and especially the opportunity to talk about my favorite church to the Ruskin Art Club. Thank you, Gabriel, for the invitation, and thanks to everyone, Eric and Stuart and Beverly and Katrina, everyone who's helped to organize this. I'll be looking at this in sort of a quasi-Ruskinian context, but this is a really informal presentation, and I want to just say that if it looks like I'm looking off to the side, it's not because I'm not interested or don't want to see all the rest of you, but it's because I've got my PowerPoint on one computer and my text on another. So I'm going to be consulting my notes every once in a while. But trust me, I'm 100% with you. Now I just need to find my cursor and the... So this is a somewhat personal journey. And it's one that I hope will suggest a connection and a theoretical line from Emanuel Swedenborg, the 18th century scientist and theologian, through John Ruskin, and down to John Ruskin, who needs no introduction to this group, certainly, down to Joseph Worcester, who was the Swedenborgian minister of the San Francisco Church that we're going to be looking at. Worcester was, as we'll see, a Swedenborgian, of course, and a powerful, if little known, figure in the world of the arts and crafts movement in San Francisco in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This journey begins with me, however, and my own journey in this sanctuary space that seats a mere 80 people. It begins with my childlike awe, which escalated to curiosity, then a later period of research and inquiry, and finally to a place of, and some writing. We'll get to that later. And finally to a place of humble, I hope, respect for what we think we know about the church and what we know we do not know. All of this happened to me with Swedenborgian-like providence. This is one of the topics that Emanuel Swedenborg wrote a great deal about, providential happenings, but mainly thanks to the fascinating circle of individuals who were involved in creating and have been involved in protecting this remarkable structure, a place that centers nature truly in the contemplation of the divine. My earliest memories of the Swedenborgian Church in San Francisco are from 1957. I was 3, and my family had found a church to attend in the neighborhood where we lived. I remember the very welcoming fireplace at the back of the church. Yes, a fireplace in a church, and the altogether home-like atmosphere that was promoted by the wood paneling and the chairs instead of pews, and the fact that everybody seemed to know each other and even like each other who were part of the parish. I still remember the sound and feel of those immense 4-square woven rush-bottomed chairs that squeaked when I shifted my little bum around. These are the dimensions. I mean, if you can sort of imagine, this is a big chair, a big, heavy, solid maple chair with a seat woven from tule rushes from the Delta. These chairs are all still in place. They're from 1895. They are original, and the woven tule is still remarkably intact. In 1929, the Reverend Othmar Tobish came from Austria and led the church as its pastor for more than 40 years. His Hungarian wife, Margit, or Morgit, as they say in Hungarian, was a gentle soul, always present at the church. They were, to me, the most wonderful and sincere people you can imagine. There was also the indomitable, here's a view of the interior, two views of the interior, just to give you an idea of the sort of family-like, home-like nature of a gathering at the church. You'll notice also, we'll talk more about this later, but in the along the wall in the upper left are 3 of 4. There are actually 4 William Keith mural paintings, and these, of course, dominate that wall, which is the north wall of the church. And on the opposite side, as you see in the slide down in the lower right, sunlight streams in from...
Okay, I think I got it going. Nope.
Compliment to the to the madrone tree trunk trusses that support the roof with the great medieval straps. That okay, we get it. And these were aspects of the church that I didn't realize were unusual. I thought all churches had fireplaces and madrone tree trunks with the bark left on and William Keith mural paintings. So there's little Teddy Bosley front and center in the first row on the left. My sister is there, a couple of heads above me. This is from a photograph, a snapshot taken at about 1958. And there's Miss Jane, the indomitable Miss Jane. We did do some medieval madrigals, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, if you could check your mute buttons, everyone, and please mute. Thank you.
There's my mother on the right with her floor-length hair up in a bun, and she was also in the choir. The church was our home away from home, particularly after my father passed away in 1959. Not a week went by, it seemed, that we weren't there 4 or 5 times for one reason or another during the week for choir practice, Thursday night suppers, you name it, or to help Miss Jane, there she is on the left edge of the photo, with shopping or some garden project or other. And then when I was an early teen, there's not as little Teddy Bosley on the right with his pal Scott. We served as acolytes, and I enjoyed helping out at the church and getting paid 75 cents per wedding and sing the medieval madrigals. So I don't know whose music that is, but it's lovely. But I'm just going to plow ahead. I loved running around in the garden with the other kids from the neighborhood, and sometimes swinging around this iron cross, which I later learned was one of the missions in Southern California, and sometimes slipping in the slime of the bird bath, which you can see at grade there behind the iron cross. This was all very familiar territory, week in and week out. Once, I don't exactly recall when I became interested in the church building as a potent symbol of architecture or an object of interest, but I do remember why. One time when I was performing my acolyte duties, sitting at the back of the church waiting for a wedding to finish, you know, the part where the couple kisses, so I could put out the candles and sweep up the rice that they were going to throw outside. I picked up a copy of this pamphlet written in 1945 by the Reverend Othmar Tobish, he from Austria with a Hungarian wife. And it was written on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the first service held at the church in March of 1895. And as I was reading through it, waiting for the kissing to happen at the end of the wedding, I realized that it described things in the church that were exactly as they still were by the time I was reading it, more than 7 decades later. It seemed incredible to my young mind that a place might be so loved and respected as to be unchanged for so many years. The creation of the church is best credited to the Swedenborgian pastor, the Reverend Joseph Worcester, there on the right. He was loved and respected during his lifetime by a diverse cross-section of creative intellectual lights in San Francisco. His famously spiritual repose coming from a contemplative nature, naturally, and a deep feeling Emanuel Swedenborg. In a nutshell, Swedenborg was an eminent scientist in 18th century Sweden who at the age of 65 had a series of dreams, what he called divine revelations, which told him how the natural world related to spiritual and celestial realms. He wrote revelations in Latin in many volumes, which have attracted both adulation from sincere spiritual seekers and derision from skeptics ever since. William Blake was an adherent, as was the artist George Ennis, and Helen Keller was a Swedenborgian, as well as Johnny Appleseed. It's a long and eclectic list, and maybe Elmo or one of the Muppets is on that list. I don't know, Don, but it wouldn't surprise me. Joseph Worcester was also friends with the naturalist John Muir, whom he met in Yosemite in the 1860s. When Muir was there for his first visit. And like Muir, Worcester believed that the divine could be found in the remotest and minutest of nature's creations. Whether John Ruskin read Swedenborg, I cannot say, but I would be surprised if Ruskin had not at least heard of Swedenborg's writings. Swedenborg's detailed scientific works alone would have been of interest to Ruskin as they were to Worcester, if not Swedenborg's more mystical theological revelations. And here are a couple of title pages from some of Swedenborg's works on the natural world and mineralogy, and a detailed a page which I think is really fascinating and something I think that Ruskin would have appreciated, as certainly as Joseph Worcester did, the very detailed drawings of geological phenomena, the likes of which, of course, Ruskin collected and described. Charles Keeler, who was also a close friend of the architect Bernard Maybeck, as well as Joseph Worcester, was another one of the creative figures in San Francisco who was influenced by Worcester. In 1905, Keeler wrote, quote, "An art spirit was taking possession of a small but increasing number of people. If one were to look for its original inspiration, they would not go far astray in attributing it in large measure to a certain quiet and retiring minister, a man of gentle nature, of devoted love of the beautiful, and of exceptionally true, though reserved, taste. From the inspiration of his modest little home and the picturesque church built under his direction, and more especially from direct contact with the man himself, a group of architects, decorators, painters, and lovers of the beautiful have acquired a new point of view. They have gained the ideal of a quiet, reserved type of spiritual beauty which has found expression in homes, in stores, and indeed in many important forms of artwork. The casual visitor to San Francisco might well look askance at the architecture of a decade or score of years ago." And here he's referring to the ubiquitous Victorian row houses, and feel that if it represents the present art taste of the population, there is little hope. But we who live here now know of the constantly growing company of young artists who are imbued with the new spirit, who have an art training and who are by example and inspiration lifting the ideals of the community, end quote. That was Charles Keeler speaking, and without fear of contradiction, I know that he was speaking about Joseph Worcester, although he doesn't name him. In these words, Keeler gives Worcester credit for shifting the public focus of art in order to better develop a greater beauty in and for the city of San Francisco, and all contemporary accounts seem to confirm this about Worcester. It's worth noting that Worcester was himself an amateur architect, having designed two simple shingled houses which still stand today on Russian Hill in San Francisco. He was more than a theorist, in other words, or a mere booster of art. And this is the circle of people that he gathered around him when it came time to design and build the Swedenborgian Church at the corner of Lyon and Washington Streets. Worcester had been a Swedenborgian minister in San Francisco for years before, but he had preached in what was called the Druids Hall for a time, and then in private homes. He would gather friends and people who were interested in learning about Swedenborg at his home in Piedmont, which you saw a William Keith painting of a moment ago. But then later on, he built for himself a small cottage on the top of Russian Hill, adjacent to three other houses that he designed for a woman named Marshall, who two of which still stand. We'll see those in a moment. All of this I knew nothing about as a child, but I may have had some sense of it or instinct. I had inherited my mother's affinity for the artistic and the antique, apparently, which in 1960 had led her to buy a then unfashionable Victorian house built in 1885, which retained its remarkably original living and dining rooms and other features. It wasn't for everyone. I remember one visitor calling the interior of our home funereal. I loved the house, but when I was about 17 or 18, I began to sense a strong preference for the relative simplicity of the church and its sanctuary. Yes, well, that's my sister and my mother and me in our Victorian house in San Francisco. That the fabric on the wall, that sort of Mauritian tapestry on the wall, was something the cats loved to climb all the way to the ceiling on. And sadly, after my mother sold the house, the interior was painted white, and I can't look at it again. I began to realize my preference for the simplicity of the interior of the church. Unlike the monotony, as I saw it, of the Victorian row houses, I felt an aesthetic affinity with the turn-of-the-century buildings that seemed to have more a kinship than a sameness, and the church was certainly one of them. I could not quite understand or express at the time this feeling, but I knew it. Joseph Worcester passed away in 1913, just a year before his friend John Muir. They were contemporaries. This is the only known photograph of Joseph Worcester, and he's got his back to us, so it's rather frustrating. But there it is. Many of the loyal parishioners of Joseph Worcester remained with the church congregation to bear witness to Worcester's legacy. One of these was the longtime Mill Valley resident Ruth Bowie, who was married by Joseph Worcester in 1910. And when you think about it, if you lived in Marin County, to get to a church in San Francisco, you couldn't cross the Golden Gate Bridge, could you? You had to have some transportation over the water, a ferry. And so it was a lengthy trip that showed her commitment. Ruth Bowie was a fixture at the church during my childhood, living into the 1970s. She unfailingly had a kind word for us young people. I remember being surprised one Sunday morning when this kindly but apparently ancient relic from a bygone era told me that she had been horseback riding earlier that morning. She couldn't have been less than 85, but she was still fit and eager to embrace life fully. Mrs. Bowie sometimes spoke of the Worcester era when his flock hung on his every word as if they were hearing direct from heaven. Mrs. Bowie was frequently the conscience of the church, too, when it came to debating changes that were proposed. She would quietly remind us that the Reverend Worcester chose these things to remain as they were for good reason. She was the last to be able to defend his vision directly and with authority, and it had the desired effect on many of us. To others, however, who advocated radical change, her passing may have given an impression of freedom from the past. I recall anxious discussions about changes to be made here and there after the Reverend Othmar Tobish passed away and was no longer there to bear witness to Ruth Bowie's witness. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was a new surge in appreciation for the city's architectural past. In 1974, Leslie Freudenheim's book, Building with Nature, appeared, boldly identifying Joseph Worcester as the pioneer and leading light of the American arts and crafts movement, as the pioneer and leading light of the American arts and crafts movement, full stop. Others had hinted at this possibility, but her conclusions were unequivocal. For many of us in the church, it wasn't just me, I don't think, it seemed like a great new understanding had dawned. I still attended church from time to time by then, but by the mid-1970s, I was at university across the bay at the University of California at Berkeley, living in the William R. Thorson House designed by Green and Green in 1909. I now know that my choice of student housing had everything to do with the love of architecture that the church had ignited in me. And with the publication of Building with Nature, I could see this inspiration in a nationally significant light. Any talk of change now to the physical aspects of the Swedenborgian Church was taken with greater deliberation and respect for history. Leslie Freudenheim was not the first modern critic to be convinced of Worcester's significant role. More than 20 years earlier, in October of 1951, the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians published an article on the early domestic architecture of the Bay region, authored by Elizabeth Kendall Thompson. For her article, she had interviewed Bruce Porter, who had famously contributed to the church the stained glass windows, as well as the Westminster glass lancet window in the tower, and probably also assisted with the landscape design. He was probably best known, for these windows certainly, but also for his landscape design for the Filoli estate in Woodside on the San Francisco Peninsula. He's also credited with supplying Joseph Worcester with a sketch of an Italian church near Verona. And this is not the self-same sketch. That has not been identified yet, but this is most likely the same church that Bruce Porter sketched on his trip, his grand tour of Europe, and passed along to Joseph Worcester. This can't be his sketch, because we know that this sketch is by Gustavus Trust, another architect, and it was done a few years after the church was built. So, however, looking at the two bell towers, it's very difficult to imagine that this was not at least the same church that inspired the exterior, at least, of the Swedenborgian Church in San Francisco. Elizabeth Kendall Thompson wrote in 1951, quote, "At a time when most Eastern architects, and of course a great many Western architects as well, were producing a riot of turreted, many-windowed mansions overlaid with gingerbread, Joseph Worcester was designing simple cottages with a freshness and restraint that for their period are all but incredible. According to Bruce Porter, artist, designer, poet, dilettante, and intimate friend of Willis Polk, it was to Worcester that hopeful young architects journeying west to seek their fortune came for advice, and it was to him that they owed their thorough grounding in good taste and simplicity. Hence, it is possible to him, to some measure, can be credited some of the underlying philosophy of architectural design in the Bay Area." And these are two of the three shingled cottages that Worcester designed in 1888 on Russian Hill for Emily Marshall. The third one was sadly demolished, but at least it was replaced with something with shingles on its exterior, as you see on the far right. Worcester's own cottage was at the top of the hill, overlooking the bay to the east, and that was the view that we saw earlier of Worcester's back and the group of young students that he mentored. They were watching Dewey's entry of the White Fleet into the bay. At Berkeley, I decided to major in art history, taking every architectural history course that was offered. I had been haunted by, there was no degree in architecture history, but there were courses in architecture history offered in the art history department as well as in the architecture department. I'd been haunted for some time by a photo of the church under construction that appeared in Leslie Freudenheim's book, Building with Nature. And I needed really to learn more and to know more about all of the characters in her narrative who were involved in the construction of the church. To further my education, I began to organize architectural walking tours in Berkeley to benefit the University Art Museum, now the Berkeley Art Museum, and in doing so learned about Bernard Maybeck, Julia Morgan, Ernest Coxhead, Willis Polk, A.C. Schweinfurth, John Hudson Thomas, John Galen Howard, Walter Stylberg, and a raft of other architects of the early late 19th and early 20th centuries. One of the structures on campus that caught my attention was the former Unitarian Church on Bancroft Avenue, now a dance studio, I believe, for the students. it reminded me to a certain degree of the Swedenborgian Church in San Francisco, both in its domestic scale and its natural materials. Note the redwood tree trunk with the bark left on as a post to support the outside corners. It called to mind, of course, the madrone tree trunks, the roof trusses on the interior of the church in San Francisco, also with the bark left on. I learned that the Berkeley Unitarian Church had been designed by A.C. Schweinfurth just a few years after the San Francisco Church was designed out of the office of A. Page Brown. Mention was occasionally made of Schweinfurth in one of my classes, and I became somewhat fixated on this lesser-known architect. Turned out he had died young of typhoid fever. I learned that a house that he had designed on the north side of Berkeley had once contained chairs identical in design to the chairs designed for the Swedenborgian Church. We don't know who designed them, but we do know they were made by Alexander Forbes, a Scotsman who had set up a furniture building shop in San Francisco with his sons. I had to find out more. There are two of the chairs, and if you can see one from the side. It's you can see one on the left from a side view, and then a kind of an angled view, one on the right. But you can also see the dimensions and the shape very similar to the one I showed earlier. It turns out that these chairs would pop up usually in different material. In fact, always in a different material from the solid maple of the San Francisco Church chairs. So these chairs are going to be either of oak or mahogany or koa, as is sometimes found. After finishing my BA in art history in 1977 and an MBA at UCLA in 1980, I took an advertising job in New York before coming back to San Francisco, where I also worked in advertising until 1990. That was the business that both of my parents had been in when they met, and so it felt like a path of least resistance, but it wasn't where my heart was. In 1990, it was my great good fortune to be offered a job at the Gamble House. And while it meant a cut in pay and leaving the Bay Area, I would be doing something that I really loved. In 1993, Dr. Robert Winter, then a professor at Occidental College, asked me to write about whatever you're on to in Northern California, as he put it. With, youthful hubris, I guess, and naivete, I volunteered to write about the Swedenborgian Church. In preparation, I devoured Richard Longstreth's book, On the Edge of the World, Four Architects in San Francisco at the Turn of the Century, published in 1983, and I discovered to my amazement that Elizabeth Kendall Thompson was still alive, she of the 1951 article, and I arranged to meet with her to see if she could recall anything more about her long ago interview with Bruce Porter. I went back to Freudenheim's source for the haunting construction photo too, shown earlier, and located many more early photos in the collection of Alfred Worcester Einerson, a descendant of a relative of Joseph Worcester, who was also still living at that time in 1993. You can imagine, perhaps, the thrill I had when I opened the package of photographs that he sent. These are some of the pictures that arrived. This one, obviously taken very early on, just after the plantings were installed. These additional construction photographs, I could not believe my eyes when I saw these, and in particular showing a detail that proves that the madronia tree trunks were structural. They're not merely an ornament, but they really do hold up the church. And these details of the brickwork, very carefully laid, interesting bond, and the brick path, all of these, the bird basin that I would decades later be slipping in the slime, and I don't see the Iron Cross there. That must have been a later addition. But this is a tremendously interesting photo full of information. And note also the wire trellis on the far left edge of the photograph. And there are other wire trellises underneath the industrial sash windows of the main sanctuary in the center of the photograph. These are, of course, are for vines to crawl up on the building, just inviting nature onto the structure itself. This is a very early photograph of the interior of the sanctuary before the William Keith murals were installed along the north wall. You can see the blank spaces there ready to accept them. And there are the 80 solid maple rush-seated chairs. Worcester would begin to, little by little, add greenery to the interior of the church, and we'll see more of that. He would grab, apparently, according to Ruth Bowie, he would bring branches of trees that he would pick up along the way on his walk from his home on Russian Hill to the church in Pacific Heights. And there's a great photograph of the magnificent chimney off-center, quite intentionally, at the back of the church. Longstreth and Thompson convinced me that the evidence they had gleaned indicated that A.C. Schweinfurth, rather than the better-known Bernard Maybeck, had been the lead designer in the office of A. Page Brown in 1894. Following the departure of Willis Polk, who had been the lead designer in Brown's office before the church project was awarded. Freudenheim has since discovered that Schweinfurth had moved down the hall from Brown's office in the Crocker building by the time the church project had begun. She feels that Schweinfurth was not involved in the design, or at least not to the extent of Maybeck or Brown. And after writing 25 years ago now, with enthusiasm that Schweinfurth should be given design credit, I have since come to the inescapable conclusion that this is wrong. I conclude this not because I've found new evidence to contradict earlier conclusions, and I don't buy Leslie Freudenheim's dismissal of Schweinfurth, but because I find the existing evidence revealing in a way that I did not appreciate 25 years ago. The church was officially a project in the office of A. Page Brown, but he was immersed in much bigger projects at the same time, such as the Ferry Building and Trinity Church on Franklin Street, on Gough Street. I appreciate that in only a few moments of consultation, Brown certainly could have given potent direction to his staff, including Schweinfurth and Maybeck, who would then carry out his wishes in the best way they could, using their own particular gifts to make the church the best that it could be. I now feel that we can see signs of Brown's distinctive hand also. For perspective, here is a sketch actually done by A.C. Schweinfurth in 1891, but out of the office of A. Page Brown, of a lemon curing warehouse in Montecito, if you can imagine such a thing. It's now the Burnham Wood Golf Club. But notice how the detail at the center of the lemon curing warehouse is so similar to the street-facing facade of the Swedenborgian Church in the lower right. Whether this was Brown's idea or Schweinfurth, it's probably impossible to know, and I think it's actually a wonderful thing that we don't know, that there are so many mysteries yet to be contemplated about this church. We can also sense Maybeck's involvement in the church, and have it from many sources that he was involved in various details, not least from himself, in the 1950s, he sort of waved his hand Frank Lloyd Wright-ishly and said, "Oh yes, I was very involved in that project." This is another church designed out of the A. Brown office at the same time of the Swedenborgian Church, this one in Limestone, Tennessee, of all places. While it's a brick structure, quite different, it does have the roundel window in the large gable, similar to not only to the Swedenborgian Church facade facing the street, but also the Unitarian Church on the Berkeley campus. I do remain convinced that A.C. Schweinfurth had a hand in the design of the church, though I no longer insist that he acted as the lead designer for Brown on this project. Bruce Porter's role, once again, as designer of the leaded art glass windows is well known. Like the others involved in the project, Schweinfurth, Maybeck, he was busy and a very young man compared to Worcester, but not too busy or too young to be sure that he made his mark on the church project. Let's look again at the players involved and their ages at the time of the construction. Worcester was 58, Keith was 56, so they were the mature men of the project. A. Page Brown, again quite busy with the ferry building, was mid-30s, and he would die, sadly, only a year after the church was built in a buggy accident in Burlingame. Maybeck was 32, Schweinfurth 30, Porter only 29, Keeler 23, and Willis Polk, who had by that time already left the Brown firm, was 27. But he was very much in the mix of architecture and architectural criticism in San Francisco at the time. In the end, however, none of this youthful involvement and energy amounts to what Joseph Worcester himself brought to the design and building of the church. "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it," from Psalm 127, which Joseph Worcester doubtless kept in mind throughout the process of planning, finding funds, designing, constructing, decorating, landscaping, and furnishing the church. It was Worcester who gently persuaded the talented and artistic team, and maybe not so gently, to follow his unorthodox architectural concepts. Those who knew Worcester might recognize his nurturing, self-effacing character when he remarked to a reporter from the San Francisco Examiner, quote, "I could have done nothing without the architect," end quote. But one might also recognize vision and determination when he added, quote, "But he was very patient with my suggestions," end quote. Worcester went on to reveal his certainty of the fitness of his idea for how the church should be built when he continued, saying, quote, "Sometimes he," that is A. Page Brown, "said that some idea of mine was not good architecture. I answered him that I cared nothing for the canons of architecture. The building must teach its lessons," end quote. This was a man alive to all of the possibilities of what he was doing. Thankfully, the church's lessons are still taught today through the devoted preservation of its history, its lack of pretense, its simple and natural beauty, the intimate sheltered garden, the natural unadorned building materials and furnishings, and through Swedenborgian correspondences and symbology envisioned by Worcester. Trees, for example, are very important to the landscape of the church because they represent knowledge in Swedenborgian theology. Joseph Worcester was not only an architect of buildings, but of people, not least the circle he drew around him to create this unique and remarkable place of timelessness and spirit. The church remains an ongoing work of the few for the benefit of many, reflecting lives of service and care for others. We owe a debt to those who have lovingly maintained the church in all of its physical and spiritual manifestations. My mother loved my mother loved this church as much as anyone, and she was occasionally pained to see historical artifacts discarded, I hate to say it, in church jumble sales as no longer useful. She would quietly notice these and buy them up, knowing them to be associated with the church but for whatever reason at that moment had fallen into some kind of neglect. I have in turn returned most of these back to the church now that there is a very thoughtful and dedicated group of people who are extremely alert to the importance of its history. One of these things, though, that hasn't been returned yet is on my shelf and something that I consult from time to time. One day it will go back. But it is this slim volume of Ruskin's The Two Paths. It's a first edition, published in 1859 in New York, first American edition, and originally went into the Women's Library in New York, but then later was accessioned into the church library, as you see from the book plate up in the upper right. In an article entitled A Sermon in Church Building by Mabel Clare Craft, published in February 1901 in the House Beautiful magazine, she wrote, quote, "It is a great deal for a church service to live up to this edifice, but the Reverend Joseph Worcester, whose thought this church embodies, compasses it, for he is gentle as a nun, ascetic as some secluded friar, entirely sanctified. He is not anxious to proselytize. He abhors a collection," that is, a collection of funds, a collection mid-service, in other words. Hidden away in a shadowy corner is an iron-bound box for voluntary contributions. You can see it in this photograph too, published in the article. On top of that case piece, there's a little iron box, which was one of the pieces that was sold at a jumble sale that my mother picked up, and I recognized it when I found this photograph in House Beautiful magazine and returned the box to the church, which is now keeping it very safely. She finished her article by saying, "But the members do not know how the pastor's salary is raised or how the church is supported." In 2004, the church was designated a National Historic Landmark, the U.S. Department of the Interior's highest honor for architectural and cultural significance. The National Landmarking Committee's commentary supported its decision by stating, quote, "The Swedenborgian Church of San Francisco is a critically important example of the American contribution to the arts and crafts movement as exemplified in new architectural imagery, integration with the site, garden design, and use of natural materials. The interior shows the employment of the decorative arts to create a special atmosphere, and with the first examples of the mission chairs, the church is also important as an example of the Swedenborgian contribution to American religious, social theory, and intellectual life. And no less so for mine. Thank you very much for your attention."
There we go. Thank you, Ted. We're open for some questions and answers. I had a question to lead off with. I had read that, that when Oscar Wilde came to San Francisco to lecture, the reaction to that from Worcester was extreme, and I can understand part of it because the arts and crafts movement is all about purposeful art and art with a message or a theme or a something. And Oscar Wilde was about art for art's sake. But can you talk about that for a little bit and just the grinding between what was a growing movement of art for art's sake and kind of a liberal point of view, and how Worcester pushed back on that so vehemently?
Yes, that's a great point. And as you may have read, Oscar Wilde was well, he was traveling the country, gave I don't know, more than 100 lectures around the United States, and one of them was called "The House Beautiful," by the way. And so it's ironic that the House Beautiful magazine would speak so highly of a place that that was so antithetical to what Oscar Wilde was talking about. He was, of course, promoting the aesthetic movement, and he had his own idea of beauty, which in the Oscar Wilde interior included famously peacocks and sunflowers and lovely young ladies striking a pose. Worcester, on the other hand, he admonished his architect and his designers, Bruce Porter and others. He said, "A pretty church I cannot bear," and that pretty much tells you what you need to know. A pretty church I could not bear. So he was not interested in a Gesamtkunstwerk, the likes of which the Greens produced, where every detail resonated with everything else. But he was more interested in the building teaching theological lessons, and so there are things that seem perhaps incongruous in the church, but to Worcester's mind, taught an important Swedenborgian theological message.
Interesting, really interesting. Please, questions, anyone, unmute yourselves and ask away. Peter.
Oh, yes, a wonderful talk, Ted. I was wondering if you could say something more about the history of which I gather is maybe not all that known, the history of the design of the chair, and didn't the chair play a role in the rather sort of somewhat fantasy invention of the concept of mission furniture?
Yes, thank you, Peter. First of all, it's an honor to have you in the audience. It's great to see you, and one of your students, Tim Toohey, as well.
Yes. Owner of a green and green
greenhouse. Is a distinguished audience. I'm humbled and flattered. Yes, and I was slightly chagrined to see the mission chair mentioned in the National Historic Landmark supporting argument, because of course the chair has nothing to do with the missions. That was a notion that that the purveyor of a commercial line derived from the Swedenborgian Church chair coined. His name was Joseph McHugh, and he had a line of furniture called the Mission Line in the late 19th century that was inspired by a prototype that was sent from San Francisco to New York for Mr. McHugh to look at and design his line of scaled down, slightly spindlier versions of the Swedenborgian Church chair. And I believe I've seen the actual prototype that was sent to New York and then later returned to San Francisco in the collection of the Livingston family in their house in just north of Calistoga, country home. So the Swedenborgian Church, we do not know who designed it. I know that the LA County Museum of Art, Wendy, has in the past at least called their church their church chair a.
Not anymore. Never before my time.
I'm not blaming you. Called the chair designed by Bernard Maybeck. I do not believe that's accurate, but I don't know. We don't know, and that's one of the other mysteries that surrounds the church. So we do know who made the chairs. It was Alexander Forbes, and but the design, the drawings have never been found. we simply don't know. But what we can certainly say is that Joseph Worcester was leaning over the shoulder of whoever was doing that drawing. Maybe it was him himself, saying, no, I'd like something more foursquare. And this is perhaps America's greatest contribution to the arts and crafts movement, is this idea of the foursquare chair. And that's what's taken away by Gustav Stickley, by Joseph McHugh, by the Stickley brothers, and et cetera, et cetera.
Alan Hess, I think you have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I wonder if you could help me understand how this design fits into the evolution of Bay Area architecture and really the foundation for modern architecture in California. The move past the Victorian. I think of other buildings like Hearst Hall by Maybeck in Berkeley, Schweinfurth's Hacienda for Phoebe Hearst, of course, Maybeck's Christian Science Church in Berkeley, Coxhead's Episcopal churches. And how does this building fit in, and does it kind of support a new direction for California architecture that we see through the rest of the century?
Right. Well, that's a big question, Alan, and nice to see you this evening too. If you just look at the massing of the church, and you appreciate its Italian village church origins on the exterior, and then you step inside, you realize you're not in Italy at all, for one thing, and so there's a sort of a disconnect there. But again, that's part of Worcester's teaching moment. And maybe how does that support the evolution of architecture in the Bay Area? Support is a is a great word to use. Those tree trunks that support the roof, I think spoke volumes to whoever would enter in the 1890s, including Maybeck and Keeler, who, as you know, less than a decade later would write The Simple Home and would proselytize about the simple wood shingled house. And so, whereas this structure does not have shingles, it was Joseph Worcester and his shingled house originally in Piedmont that woke Maybeck and Keeler up to the possibilities of domestic architecture that looked very different from the Victorian row house that was still going up for another 10 years all along the hills of San Francisco. So there was a tension building. And in the east, where Worcester was from, he was from Boston, right? He was a Bostonian, and his family were all Swedenborgian ministers. And he and his family were close friends with Henry Hobson Richardson. And the shingle style that began in the Boston area with Richardson's work was known to Joseph Worcester. So these ideas crisscrossed the country, but really did a huge leap from the east to San Francisco in one fell swoop. And if you then think about William Worcester and his appreciation for Bernard Maybeck as early as the 1930s, you begin to see the through line into modernism, into regional modernism. It's not a straight line, but it's definitely a through line in my view, anyway.
What else? Other questions?
I think it's a fairly simple one, but like many questions, it may not be. You know a lot about the church. Not too long ago, a few years ago, we had a very lovely Ruskin conference at the church. Gabriel was there, and Clive Wilmer, myself, Sarah Atwood, and others. So my question is, given what you know about the church and its living reality now, is it either under structural or financial threat? And if so, what is being done about those things?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And then Ryan, you're next. I see you've got your hand raised. And nice to see you from Rose Valley. The church is, well, you know, as any significant work of architecture that's left out in the rain is under environmental threat. But the good news is that there is a congregation now that's very alert to its importance and the importance of maintaining it. The National Historic Landmark nomination, which was approved in 2004, really has left an indelible impression on not just the congregation, but on the neighborhood and the city, and anybody who visits there. It's still very much appreciated as a wedding site. People love to get married there. I think it's perhaps underappreciated by its immediate neighbors. San Francisco has changed a lot, and I think the hustle and bustle of the tech industry is somewhat passing it by. But it also might be an opportunity for the church to raise money to keep their conservation efforts going. Right now, it seems to be stable, and I do have hope that and confidence that it will continue to be appreciated by the people who know it best. They always need money. Send them a check. The Swedenborgian Church in San Francisco, 2107 Lyon Street, or 3200 Washington Street, I think is where they get their office mail.
And if you'll notice on the invitation there, I've included a button for the Swedenborgian Church donations.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.
Also, I must say that we have, as a member of our 40 people, Denise Demer, who was married at the Swedenborgian Church. Edie Caldwell was as well, but she couldn't get her sound to work. Denise, do you want to tell us a little bit about the experience of being married at the church?
Unmute.
Unmute. No, yeah.
Okay, I'm unmuted. But that was just divinely rich and informative. I was married there in 1984, and it was the most magical experience. I've always, I'm a San Franciscan. And so I always,
I think we.
I couldn't help but know about it. But this really fleshed out all of the knowledge. I mean, it set me straight on Maybach and all sorts of things. I was an art conservator. I actually worked on William Keith paintings, so it meant a lot. Just that was just one of the aspects that meant a lot. I worked on Julia Morgan. I worked at in conserving art at Hearst Castle too. So it was sort of, I just love California and all of that sort of period of California, and it's a unique building, that church. But anyway, so the wedding, can I just tell you about it was so romantic. It was a cold, rainy November evening wedding. And I had people, it was, of course it had to be small, and the fireplace was roaring. They don't have electricity, do they? I don't think they did, because we had candles.
Yeah.
It was candles and this fireplace and the rain and these people from all over the world, a few friends from all over the world. And I had a cappella Bach choir. It was just divine, and I feel so thrilled that I was thrilled then, and I'm still thrilled to hear about how special this place was, and it still is, and I want it to survive, and I'm so glad that it really holds. I mean, it's really well built. I mean, obviously the furniture was there, those same chairs, everything was sturdy and simple and yes, in that sort of way, very spiritual. and that sort of, I just loved it, and I still love it, and I love the whole connection of all of the creative community that was involved. It's just really fabulous to hear about it, and so I thank you so much for your talk. I'm so glad I got to hear this.
Thank you, Denise. I appreciate that very much. In fact, my wife, who's also named Denise, and I were married at the church also on a rainy late November day. I don't think it was the same day because we would have.
Isn't it perfect though in the rain for a wedding?
Really?
It kind of is.
And I do think we've met before, Denise. Are you related to Robert?
I am.
There you
That's
go.
my brother.
Yeah, we may have met. I met him when I was up at the Livermore's place
Yeah.
years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, Ryan had a question, and Melva had a question also. Ryan, are you still?
Yes. Thank you very much, Ted, and Denise for your spiritual experience there. I had my own experience just having known about that church for 20 some years and finally getting to see it about 2 years ago, just after a flight from San Francisco. I arrived on a Sunday morning and the choir was practicing before the service. And I just sort of walked up, and the neighborhood was very unassuming and low. And I could hear the voices drifting out of the open windows. And I just sort of sat outside in that little garden and listened for a few minutes before going in. And it truly was one of the most spiritual arts and crafts experiences I've ever had. And hearing your talk tonight just reinforced what a special place and so personal for you. So I appreciate that. And my question is, of course, a Pennsylvania question from where I hail, but when I was getting a tour from one of the guides at the San Francisco church, I mentioned the other Swedenborgian church in the cathedral that's nearby in Bernathan. And the reaction of the guide was, "Oh, that's the high church." And there clearly was this interesting distinction between the two, because of course this is a Gothic cathedral, and what you have is this amazing California rustic structure. And I just wonder, was there a connection with, aside from Swedenborgianism, with Raymond Pitcairn, and was he inspired by the San Francisco church? Do you know much?
So Raymond Pitcairn, who was the driving force behind the Bernathan Cathedral, was very alert to the arts and crafts movement, but more, he was paying greater attention to Ralph Adams Cram, for example, and his work on the East Coast. I don't know if he was aware of the Swedenborgian Church in San Francisco. He may well have been. I mean, there aren't that many Swedenborgian churches, and the Bernathan Cathedral postdates the San Francisco Church, so he may well have been aware of it. But another interesting connection with the Pitcairn family is Raymond Pitcairn's brother, I think, who was Robert Pitcairn, who became a client of Charles and Henry Green in Pasadena, the Pitcairn House on State Street, which is now a property of the Westridge School, was really one of the first Green and Green houses to incorporate all of what we consider to be the classic Green and Green attributes of the extended eaves and all of that. So the arts and crafts movement was certainly in the air, and the Bernathan Cathedral is a wonderful example of the kind of the Gothic strain of the arts and crafts movement, in my view, and is well worth a detour to Bernathan, which is a an entire Swedenborgian community. But as you say, the high church, they have bishops and that sort of thing, and very different from Joseph Worcester's idea of what a Swedenborgian congregation should look like, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for joining us. Melba, you've been very patient.
Yes, I'm Hugh, actually. This is Melba.
I'm Melba.
I was wondering if the church was in any way a reflection of the Swedenborg's theology and mysticism. Was that, I mean, were the people who designed the church, the architects and designers, were they influenced by the Swedenborgian strain of Christianity, and or was it just a gig?
Oh gosh, I would say it was most definitely not just a gig. These were people who were definitely listening to Joseph Worcester. He was the Swedenborgian filter through which these artists and designers worked. And so, whereas they may not have been reading Swedenborg, that is, Bernard Maybeck, to my knowledge, didn't read Swedenborg. William Keith may or may not have. They absorbed the theology through Joseph Worcester. And so William Keith actually attended services. And he would famously sit at the back in a dark corner and not participate, but he was there. But he, I don't think he would have called himself a Swedenborgian. None of them did. But they were all deeply affected by Joseph Worcester and the influence that he had on the larger world of art in the San Francisco Bay Area at that time. And Worcester was, by all accounts, he was someone to be reckoned with, despite his being very quiet and very shy, certainly camera shy. If anybody ever finds a photograph of Joseph Worcester, the whole world has got to know about it, because there only exists, as anyone is aware, as far as anyone is aware, that one photograph of him taken from behind. There is a photograph of the interior of his cottage on Russian Hill. Doesn't have him in it, but it feels very much like an anteroom to the church itself, with the same kinds of intrusions of branches of trees and the natural world inside and out. So that idea of nature subsuming architecture is certainly what Worcester promoted, and he had willing participants in William Keith. And if anybody was mystical in that group, I would say it was William Keith. His paintings, like those of George Ennis, are deeply cerebral and tonalist and full of mystery, in my personal opinion. And maybe Denise or Stuart, you've got some ideas on that.
Yeah, I mean, Keith was the architecture then a reflection of the Swedenborg's ideas about nature, and is there a reflection in the way they went about actually conceiving the church that had to do with Swedenborg's ideas?
Yeah. So just one example, as I mentioned earlier, the symbolism of trees corresponding to knowledge in Swedenborgian theology, to me, explains why Worcester chose to have the madrone tree trunks with the bark left on the inside of the church, as well as planting trees in the garden. And I showed you early photographs of the garden with unestablished shrubs. But if you go there today, there is still a cedar of Lebanon there, I believe, and a redwood, very mature specimens that have been there throughout, and also correspond to Swedenborgian symbology relating to knowledge. That is knowledge of the divine. I mean, let's be clear. So Swedenborg is rough sledding for a lot of people, but one thing I find very accessible in his work is his work on heaven and hell, heaven and its wonders, and hell, and that resonates with William Blake's work on heaven and hell, and the symbology is it's on three levels. Okay, I'm getting into too much Swedenborgian theology here, but Swedenborg's correspondences are on three levels: on the natural level, with the literal meaning of things, the spiritual meaning of things, and then in his worldview, is in his celestial view, the celestial level of things, the heavenly meaning, and those three distinct levels are explained in his writings. And if Joseph Worcester were here, I'm sure he would do us the favor that he didn't do us in writing it all down, of telling us what exactly in the church means what. So that's maybe yet another one of the mysteries that we're meant to contemplate. So I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but I hope that at least gets you started with an answer.
Yes, thank you very much. I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. Victoria Martino has raised hand.
Victoria?
Yes, thank you. That was a really fascinating presentation. I studied at Harvard and was an art history major, so I walked up and down Quincy Street all the time. And I remember from the very first day I was at the campus, I was totally fascinated by the Swedenborgian Church on the corner of Quincy Street, and very surprised to find out it had nothing to do with Harvard University. And if I recall correctly, that was designed by Warren, who started the School of Architecture at Harvard, and also was involved with the arts and crafts movement. So I was just wondering, because I think the Swedenborgian Church in Cambridge is from like 1901 or something.
That's exactly right, 1901. H. Langford Warren, yeah, he was very much a part and parcel of the arts and crafts movement. He had classical training, of course, and gave classical training, but in another one of those wonderful things that I no longer consider to be a coincidence, Charles Green apprenticed with H. Langford Warren when after he left MIT in 1891. That is, after Charles Green graduated MIT in 1891, he apprenticed with H. Langford Warren, and so got some good early arts and crafts chops from him. And he was Warren was a founder of the Arts and Crafts Society in Boston as well in the late 1890s.
It's just, to me, I was wondering if you could comment on the extraordinary disparity between two Swedenborgian churches on two coasts, roughly constructed around the same time, around the same period of the Swedenborgian movement in the United States.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of that is the West Coast, the frontier of the West speaking, and certainly a lot of it is Joseph Worcester himself speaking. I mean, he left Boston for a reason. And I think it was, and he went to Yosemite Valley in the 1860s when people weren't going to Yosemite Valley for holiday reasons. He was a seeker of the natural world and looking for the divine in nature, much like John Muir. And so to create this church that brings the outdoors in is completely characteristic of Joseph Worcester. And if John Muir had been an architect, he might have done something like this too.
Yeah, that's what I found so fascinating about your presentation, because I kept thinking through the whole presentation about the church in Cambridge and what an extraordinary contrast this Gothic revival stone construction in Cambridge, and then this beautiful, organic wooden construction.
Yeah, the congregations in the Boston area, the Swedenborgian congregations in the Boston area, including Cambridge, were much more conservative than what transpired in the West. In fact, there were two Swedenborgian churches in San Francisco, and there was one that was much more aligned with the conservative mainstream, including the Boston churches. And then there was Joseph Worcester, and he was a maverick. He was ostracized from the mainstream Swedenborgian church because of his views being too, well, I guess you might say too nature oriented. Maybe they were too aligned with Ruskin and Muir's writings. I wasn't there, so I can't say. And unfortunately, Worcester didn't leave very much of a written record for us. I was reading one letter from Joseph Worcester to John Muir the other day, written in 1893, where Worcester was giving his opinion about some flower beds that were to be planted around the California building, a reference to the Chicago International Exposition, and Bernard Maybeck was involved in part of the design of the California building. And so, he wanted Muir to step in and suggest some characteristic California flora for the California building at the Chicago Fair. His fingers were in just about everything when it came to art, architecture, landscape at that time, and it's still a wonder to me that he's so little known. Worcester, that is.
Well, I think now will be the Renaissance with all the environmental movements. Anyway, thank you again. Wonderful presentation. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Any final questions? Ted, thank you so much for this amazing, enlightening presentation and for letting us all into your thoughts about this amazing place.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, everybody, for attending. It's great to see all of you.
Wonderful, really.
Great.
Thanks, Ted.
Ted, thank you so much for this really extraordinary and extraordinarily rich presentation. This is Gabriel Meyer, the Executive Director of the Ruskin Art Club. I want to invite all of you to the annual Ruskin Birthday Bash on February the 11th, Thursday, February the 11th at 5 p.m. Ruskin's birthday, as most of you know, is actually February 8th, but this is the closest that we could get schedule-wise to Ruskin's day. It's going to be a wonderful evening, very rich evening. We have a concert from the youthful but highly professional Zelter Quartet, string quartet from the Thornton School of Music at USC, who will do a program of Haydn and Beethoven string quartets. We will have an intermission feature with readings from Ruskin's work, read by actresses Joanna Cassidy and Katie Mazer. We will also have poems and art by respectively Stuart Denenberg, our own Stuart Denenberg, and Leonard Baskin. And the evening will be capped by a very special musical premiere. And we think it well may be a US musical premiere. So don't miss this. It will be a great and rich evening, and we look forward to having you all there. Please visit our website at www.ruskinartclub.com for more information and details about the upcoming season, membership information, newsletter subscription information, and Ruskin resources. For those of you who've inquired about past lectures from the 2020 series, we've launched a new YouTube Ruskin Art Club channel, and you will find all of last fall's offerings there now, and also the first lecture of this season, the presentation just a few weeks ago on Ruskin and photography. And we'll be posting more and more all the time. This lecture will be shortly up on the Ruskin YouTube channel. You can either access it directly on YouTube, or you can go to the website under contact, and you can find a direct link to our channel. So again, what a rich evening this has been, and we look forward to seeing you for the Ruskin birthday bash. Thank you very much.
Please check if you had any chats.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you, Gabriel.
Take care.